Shalom and welcome again to another edition of Seekers of Meaning, the podcast arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. I am your host, Rabbi Richard Adress, the director of Jewish Sacred Aging. We welcome you and I thank you for joining us. You can reach me at Rabbi Adress at jewishsacredaging.com, and we invite you to visit our website as well as to the Jewish Sacred Aging Facebook page. Today, it is with a great honor that we welcome to the Seekers of Meaning microphone Dr. Michael Meyer, the Adolph Ochs Professor Emeritus of Jewish History at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, Cincinnati campus. Dr. Meyer, Michael, welcome to Seekers of Meaning, and it is a pleasure to see you. And first of all, let me begin with a plug for the book. Because the book is spectacular. Thank you very much. It's obviously a work of great love. And for my colleagues out there or people who are involved in adult education and programming in congregations, regardless, or organizations, JCCs, check this out. Good book club, excellent sermonic material, lots in there. So let us get to the book. Rabbi Leo Baeck, Living a Religious Imperative in Troubled Times, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. So, Michael, thank you very, very much. Let me just begin. Why? What drew you to Leo Baeck? What was the Ochs that got you involved with him?
There is a lot that draws me to Leo Baeck, beginning with my own personal background. I was born in Berlin, Germany, spent the first 3.5 years of my life under the Nazi oppression at a time when Rabbi Leo Baeck was the head of German Jewry, the great source of morale in those difficult times. So I had an interest in exploring this person who was so significant in terms of my own earliest beginnings. But then once I became an academic, I decided to explore what I could about Leo Baeck, both in terms of his thought and in terms of his life. When I was still a graduate student, I translated one of his most important essays called Theology and History into English for Judaism magazine. Since then, I have written at various times on Leo Baeck and was one of the editors of his collected works. Baeck has been for me, however, not merely a subject of research. He has been very much a personal model. I would not have devoted so many years to studying him if I didn't believe that his message and his life have something to say to Jews and beyond Jews, to human beings in our own time. So it's been, Richard, a very long relationship and a relationship of great respect. And even though I never met the person personally, of a kind of intellectual love.
Well, that comes through on almost every page in the book. Was Baeck the moral compass of his time? You write about his view of prophecy. You allude to the moral compass of the prophets. Was Baeck a moral compass?
Yes, I think Baeck was a moral compass in his own time, and I think he is also for those who read his works today. Baeck had a lifelong interest in the Jewish prophets because he believed that the prophets, better than any other group of individuals within Jewish history, expressed the idea that morality is not a matter of convenience. It's not a matter of, I'll do it if I want to do it. The prophets insisted upon justice. They insisted upon doing the right, even if it meant detriment to your own personal life, as the prophets did, as they suffered at the hands of those who would not accept the prophet's message. So it was something about the strict, unswerving, and uncompromising morality of the prophets that drew Baeck to him. And yes, I think that creates a kind of moral compass for how often do we have to make decisions and we choose the compromise or the easier choice. For Beck, it was the right choice, even if it was the more difficult choice. That, I think, is a moral compass for our time.
That leads to a question that, as I'm reading the book and you're outlining that period of time from, especially a little bit, well, from the Nuremberg laws through Kristallnacht to when he was taken to Theresienstadt, and people left, and people came to him and say, "Get out." He stayed, and there was one passage in the book, I think you write, when that he stayed because, in essence, he was a rabbi. This was his quote, I think, his flock. That Talk to me about how when you research this, right? Well, that's that moral compass. Is it answer to a higher calling? Why didn't he leave?
Well, let me begin by saying this. What has been written about Leo Baeck simply calls him Leo Baeck. I made it a point to title the book Rabbi Leo Baeck because I think in the various articles that have been written and books that have been written about Baeck, there has been insufficient emphasis upon his role as a rabbi. To be sure, Baeck was a scholar, Baeck was a thinker, but I would say most fundamentally, he was a rabbi. And for him, being a rabbi meant obligation. It meant duty. It meant response to God's commandment, the way that Baeck had formulated it many times. And that meant if your duty as a rabbi is to take care of your flock, even under the most difficult of circumstances, then you must do that. And in his own life, as you pointed out, he had opportunities to flee from obligation, to flee from duty. He was offered positions in England, he was offered positions in the United States, but he chose to remain with his flock in Germany, where he saw himself as playing a very important role, not simply in terms of the governing role that he played for German Jewry, but a morale raising role. It was so easy for German Jews as their situation got worse and worse during the time of the Hitler regime for German Jews to despair, to resort to suicide rather than to continue. Beck gave them courage. Beck made them realize that even though the Nazis may derogate and denigrate all Jews, and you feel, if you listen to the propaganda line, that you as a Jew are not even properly a human being, Beck made them realize that Jews, like all human beings, were children of God. And however the Nazis may define you, that is not the way you need to understand yourself. You stand before God, ultimately. You do not stand and do not need to justify yourself before the Nazi authorities. Beck spoke out freely. He spoke out courageously. He was arrested 5 times for what he said, but he insisted on doing it. In remaining, as you said, until in January 1943, he was deported to the ghetto of Theresienstadt.
And then you write this absolutely wonderful chapter about him being the rabbi of Theresienstadt. Could you just talk a little bit about that, because it's just enlightening and very, very powerful and very human and very rabbinic too, because the pastoral work there.
Theresienstadt has sometimes been called a concentration camp. It was not that. That is to say, the inmates there did not have numbers tattooed on them, even though they were assigned a number. They did not wear striped uniforms, but they hungered, and they died in large numbers. And from there, Most of them were transported to death camps. In Theresienstadt, Leo Baeck saw it as his duty, there as in Berlin earlier, to raise morale, to give them a sense that there was a significant Jewish past to which Jews were heir, and a strong belief in a better future. Baeck stressed the importance of tikvah, of hope in Judaism, that even though you are in a situation where you may only think of where do I get another meal, it was possible even under those circumstances to feel that you were a child of God. Leo Baeck gave lectures in Theresienstadt where he tried to raise people's spirits intellectually and spiritually. He spoke about Plato and Aristotle, Greek philosophers, but he also spoke about Maimonides and Mendelssohn, important Jewish thinkers. One of the inmates there recalled spending some time with Leo Baeck and talking about everything but about their problems there. I would put it this way, and I put it this way in the book. Baeck enabled people to transcend the pain and suffering of their lives, transcend it by looking backwards. The Jews had survived through all those centuries. Forward, the Jews hoped for a messianic future, and also vertically upward, the hope the Jews expressed in their relationship to God. So even though they were there hungry, suffering, Rabbi Leo Baeck in the ghetto enabled them to realize that they were human beings and not subhuman, as the Nazis defined them.
When people, I believe that people are in many ways, and you allude to this in the book, uh, totally impacted by obviously the times and the context in which they live, and in the arc of Beck's life, which you categorize. It seemed to me in reading the book that the Dusseldorf years were instrumental in his own transition and in his growth as a rabbi and as a human being. Would I be wrong in assuming that, or that his period of time in Dusseldorf, how important was that to his overall arc of change and his spiritual growth?
When Leo Baeck was ordained at the liberal seminary in Berlin, he went first, as is still typical today of rabbis immediately upon ordination, to a small congregation in the town of Oppeln in Silesia, and he spent a number of years there before going on to the larger community of Düsseldorf and ultimately to the largest German Jewish community, that of Berlin. Leo Baeck was a thinker. Leo Baeck was a preacher, preached regularly, but his preaching in his early years lacked vibrancy. It was said sometimes that a sermon by Leo Baeck was really a dialogue between Leo Baeck and God. He needed to communicate better with people. And it was that he learned in this intermediate-sized community of Düsseldorf. I note in the book that in order to improve his oratorical skills, he actually took lessons with an actor who happened to live in Düsseldorf, so that by the time he got to Berlin, he was more effective upon the pulpit. And in fact, when he gave lectures later in Theresienstadt, there were those who said that his lectures were the very best of anyone of those who gave lectures to the inmates in Theresienstadt. So it was a process, I would say, in Düsseldorf of learning to communicate better, especially from the pulpit, which would be important for him, especially when he came to Berlin, where he sometimes had to speak to large congregations, especially at the high holidays. Dusseldorf also was followed almost immediately by his service as a chaplain in World War I. He was one of the first Jewish chaplains to serve in the German army. And there he made use of his rabbinical experience, both in Oppeln and in Düsseldorf, to be able to communicate in a setting which was very different from that of a city pulpit. There he spoke to the Jewish soldiers in a very informal way, often from that of a soldiers, giving them hope, writing letters home for them so that their families would know that their loved one, this wounded soldier, was in good shape. The soldiers themselves sometimes were unable to write letters if they were severely wounded. Um, this also opened Beck up to something which was an important element of his entire life, and that is his relationship to Christianity. In World War I, he became, as chaplains often are, minister not only to the Jewish soldiers, but also to non-Jewish soldiers, sometimes conducting funerals for non-Jewish soldiers as well. So I would say if one traces the trajectory of Leo Baeck's life, it was one that in the course of his life, he reached greater levels of ability and sophistication as ever greater challenges faced him, beginning with a small congregation through Düsseldorf, through Berlin, through the army, and ultimately to the Nazi period, where he was the titular head of all German Jewry, and then in the concentration camp, or the ghetto, more correctly, of Theresienstadt.
Again, we're speaking with Dr. Michael Meyer, the Adolph Ochs Professor Emeritus of Jewish History at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion on the Cincinnati campus. And we're speaking about Dr. Meyer's latest book, Rabbi Leo Baeck, Living a Religious Imperative in Troubled Times, University of Pennsylvania Press, available all over and, of course, on Amazon. Michael, I want to jump to a paragraph that when I read it, I stopped and I said, why? I could have just read this on any website in 2021. And for those of you who are following in the book or get the book, go immediately to the second paragraph on page 45. It's a chapter that you entitled A Thinker Engaged, and it's about that period of time in Germany with the German Jewish community. But you write this, in urban centers, especially Berlin, where about a third of German Jewry lived, a new spirit was felt. In ever larger circles, Jews came into social contact with their Gentile neighbors. Despite varying degrees of continuing antagonism towards Jews, non-Jews increasingly were willing to marry Jews, thereby, without intent, aggravating a situation of low fertility that put the future of demographically substantial German Jewry in doubt. There were also more Jews with little interest in their communal institutions who were eager to avoid paying for their maintenance. They made their exit from organized Judaism without conversion, remaining Jews only by the racial definition that would in a little more than a decade be imposed on them from the outside, unquote. You could have read, this was almost word for, well, not word for word, of the last two Pew reports of the American Jewish community in 2021. When I read this and knew that we were going to talk, I had to, I marked it in the book because I wanted to ask you about this. How present is this paragraph in your view as a historian, as a Beck scholar, as a teacher of students at the seminary? Do you think it's possible to walk down this road again? Because some of this stuff that you write about in this paragraph, not all of it, but some of it is right out of the last two Pew reports.
Yes, there clearly is a parallel here. Even as over the last generation, there have been sociologists in the United States who claimed that these same factors would lead to a diminution of the American Jewish population. So the same situation of increasing secularization and alienation was true in Germany. And there, too, there was at least one sociologist who claimed uh, uh, before the Nazi period that in the course of time, German Jewry would disappear for the reasons that I mentioned in what you just read. Leo Baeck was very aware of that and made efforts to try to strengthen Jewish identity. He spoke to his fellow Jews, and especially the liberal Jews, because one has to remember that Leo Baeck was a liberal Jew, a liberal rabbi, and said, for too long, we have been trying to be up to date, to try to be like our Gentile neighbors. That is not going to preserve Jewish identity. We have to understand that the challenge to the Jews is not to be more like everybody else. And he said, we Jews are the great nonconformists of history. We need to preserve that identity. Then along came the Holocaust, with its 6 million Jews having passed away. And Leo Baeck at that time made a suggestion which was made years later by Rabbi Alexander Schindler in his speech in 1978. Leo Baeck was a believer that Jews should proselytize, that only by turning not only to fellow Jews, not only to those, as Rabbi Schindler mentioned, who were mixed married, but to alienated Jews of all kinds, unaffiliated Jews, those Jews who had been influenced by secularism, by an excess of universalism. He pointed out how important it was for Jews who played roles in general organizations to stress the Jewish element. For example, Leo Baeck, in a number of speeches, praised German Jewish women who were part of the general feminist organization in Germany. But what he suggested to them was that this feminism of theirs should be related to their own Jewishness. Um, Leo Baeck was very upset about the Jewish culture of the big city. He longed, in a way, with almost some nostalgia, for a smaller Jewish community where people knew each other, where there were personal relationships among Jews, where the Jewish community was more organic and there wasn't the anomie that you found in a community the size of Berlin. So Leo Baeck was someone who was well aware of these trends and sought to combat them in any way that he was able to do so, and was particularly concerned about Jewish survival when numbers had been diminished on account of the Holocaust.
The you alluded to the feminist aspect, and you write about Rabbi Regina Joseph, in the book, and also about Beck's wife, who died I early. Talk to me a little bit about from your research, because when I was reading through the book and you got to that point of her death, There seemed to be like this really affected him. Did it change his view of his own life, of his responsibility? Did he become more insular? It just seemed to be a major turning point in his life.
Leo Baeck, I would not say was a feminist in the modern sense that we use that word today, but he had a great appreciation of the role of Jewish women. He favored uh, ordination of Regina Ionas, who was also transported to the ghetto in Theresienstadt. Um, he particularly appreciated that there were some Jewish women like Hannah Karminski who, like Beck, refused to leave, who also could have left, but insisted on continuing to work for the Jewish community. In the case of Karminski, in social welfare, which became ever more important. Leo Baeck married Natalie, his wife, when he was still in Oppeln. She was supposedly the most beautiful woman in town. They had a very happy marriage. Natalie was not a feminist. She played the role of the traditional Rebbitzin, the traditional rabbi's wife. She helped her husband in every way, but didn't have a career of her own, as opposed to Beck's daughter, who went to university and was much more of a modern feminist. Leo Baeck was ambivalent about the matter of men and women sitting together at services. Uh, because it was a tradition in Germany for many years, and liberal synagogues as well, that men and women would sit separately, not women not in a gallery, but men on one side and women on the other side. But Beck realized that in the younger generation, there were more and more people, young Jewish congregants, who wanted to sit with their wives or with their family. And therefore, when a new synagogue was built in Germany, just at the end of the Weimar period, and Leo Baeck was himself a congregant at that time, he was no longer speaking from a pulpit. He was involved with Jewish community affairs. When his wife became ill in 1937, he chose to sit with her and said that that gave him great comfort in his time of sorrow on account of her illness. Um, so that Leo Baeck, I think, gradually progressed in his views with regard to feminism. He did realize that the changing status of the woman was a revolutionary, a revolution in religious life. And he wanted to channel that revolution so that it would work for the good of Judaism, so that Jewish women would play a large role in Jewish life, and that they would not be drawn to aspects of Weimar culture that Beck rejected. I should mention two items that are very important in my book, um, and I think are perhaps the most among the most original elements in it. One is that Beck was a bit of a Puritan. He believed that a rabbi should not be out for seeking pleasure. He distinguished between pleasure and joy. Weimar was in many ways a pleasure culture. It was a culture of loose sexual morality, which affected the Jewish community as it did the non-Jewish community. Beck was straight-laced. There's no question about it. Um, he was more a product of the Wilhelmine period preceding the Weimar than he was of Weimar. So that is the one thing. The other thing, I think, is Beck's relationship to what we call in Hebrew Kiddush Hashem, that is to say, martyrdom. One of the interesting things that I discovered in the course of writing the book is that the name Beck was, according to a family tradition, short for Ben Kadoshim, for a martyr. And there were martyrs in Leo Baeck's family in the Middle Ages. There was such a family tradition. So that Leo Baeck, in remaining with his flock, in risking his own life, was in a way following a family traditioning and opening himself up to the possibility that, like a Baeck ancestor, he may have to give his life al Kiddush Hashem. I know you're interested in something that relates to that, and that is the matter of the statement made by Mahatma Gandhi with
I was
regard
going to
to what the Jews should be doing. Gandhi, who was in many ways a great personality of the 20th century and did a great deal for his people, when asked about what the Jews should do in the face of the Nazi oppression, said they should engage in a mass suicide, for that would call the world's attention to the situation of the Jews. Well, needless to say, that runs totally against Judaism, totally against what Baeck believed. For even though Leo Baeck was willing to risk his life if necessary, he certainly believed in the preciousness and the sanctity of life, which is so central to Judaism. He could not imagine that kind of thing happening. And that also relates to another subject, if I may. Leo Baeck has been criticized for not making fellow Jews aware, when he was in Theresienstadt, of the fact that the deportations would lead to a death camp. And there are those like Hannah Arendt and others who thought that was, and Paul Tillich, who thought that was the wrong decision. But I think it was a Jewish decision, because Baeck was aware that if knowledge of what was likely to happen spread throughout Theresienstadt, there would be mass suicide. And even for those that were deported, there was at least a slim chance of survival. And after the war, there were survivors. And I cite a couple of such survivors who said to Leo Baeck, "You made the right decision. If you had told us, I might very well have committed suicide and would not have survived the Holocaust."
yeah.
So I got a lot in there.
No. You read as a proper professor at HUC. You read my mind because I did want to, because that's when you're reading the book. It's in a passage about the Evian conference. That at the bottom of that page you said, "Oh, and Mahatma Gandhi made this suggestion," and I remember reading it. I was like, "Whoa, out of left field, Mahatma Gandhi is here telling But then this is why this book is so powerful, I think, as an educational tool, because that what you just described, that moral question, and him being, as we started with, is a moral compass. How much truth do you tell? In particular, I'm a believer in context. I think Judaism is a very, very contextual religious civilization that understands the context of a particular situation. And so that, what you just talked about, I could see a confirmation class or a youth group program at a camp saying, here's a real life, taking this. What would you do? How much truth do you tell? And I know in the medical ethics responsa, because this comes up sometimes in the Jewish sacred aging workshops on end of life. How much truth do you tell a patient? And this is why as I said before, there are many depths to the book that hopefully, as people walk through it, there's so much to discuss. I also have to ask you, because in his life, at that same trajectory, at the same embrace of historical circumstances, is the Basel Conference, the beginning of the Zionist movement, played out against German Jewry, played out against the development of Nazism, played out against Herzl. Where was Baeck on the establishment of a state of Israel as a Jewish homeland?
Good. That's requires a rather long answer, but I will try to give it. Leo Baeck, in his early years, was not an anti-Zionist, but neither was he a Zionist, and he never became a party member, that is to say, a political Zionist. But his life describes his coming ever closer to the Zionist idea. And from the very beginning, he was opposed to anti-Zionism. When he attended a conference of fellow rabbis, conservative ones as well as liberal ones, at the time of the first Zionist Congress, he refused to vote in favor of a condemnation of the Zionist movement. He remained neutral at that point, but very upset when a colleague of his was fired from his position in Berlin because he had been pro-Zionist. Baeck very much believed in free speech. He believed, like Stephen Wise in America, in a free pulpit. In the course of the 30s, Baeck became ever closer to the Zionist movement. He was involved with the Keren Kayemet L'Yisrael that bought land for Jews in Israel. He was a member of the Jewish Agency. And when the state was established, he thought that this was indeed a providential act. At the same time, like so many German Jews, he was a dove as far as Israel politics is concerned. He joined together with Albert Einstein, who was a close friend of his, to argue for a state that would not be based on terrorism on either side. And of course, there was terrorism on the Jewish side as well as on the Palestinian side in 1947. He also, together with a couple of colleagues in Great Britain, where Baeck lived after the war, founded an organization that would solicit funds for individuals, Jewish and Palestinian, who had suffered as a result of the Israeli War of Independence. He found himself very close to the kibbutzim in Israel, interestingly enough. There were a number of German Jews in the 1930s who made aliyah to kibbutzim like Hazoreah, for example, and others. And Leo Baeck, even though he was in some ways conservative in politics, let's say his style with a three-piece suit and the like was sort of conservative in character, he nonetheless, and this was another remarkable thing I found, he was very much open to what I would call religious socialism, the kind of thing that Martin Buber had favored on the kibbutzim in Israel. And he actually spoke to socialist groups in Germany. He had a great appreciation for social justice. And as I also point out in the book, one of his colleagues at that time said that one of Beck's favorite sayings was "Letaken olam b'malchut Shaddai," to fix the world under the image of God, which has become so much a part of liberal and conservative Judaism in the United States today. And here is Leo Baeck pointing out that whereas in Christianity, and he does this repeatedly, the focus is on the salvation of the individual soul. it is on the individual person. It is on the world to come. In Judaism, there is no religion without social justice. One turns to the world. Baeck was in many ways someone who emphasized Jewish messianism in terms of the ultimate goal of a society and a world in which justice and peace reign. So Leo Baeck then has to be understood in those terms as well as a social progressive.
Yeah, you write in the book that Baeck was called to be of the world, but not in it. And in reading some of the other aspects of the book, how would he react now to the public position of so many colleagues taking very active roles in political life, demonstrating very, very, open about political issues, from Black Lives Matter to the environment to a whole slew of things? Would he be marching with them?
I absolutely believe so, yes. His criticism of the Protestant church in Germany was that they supported the state regardless of what the state did, that they were subservient to the state and thought that that was the proper role. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And that American Jewry, particularly liberal reform American Jewry, put social justice, social action at the very heart of its activity, was something that Leo Baeck was very open to, and I think very supportive of. He believed that a religion that neglects the world and doesn't make its views known, but focuses only on the individual, is giving up a principal task of proper religion.
Before we start running out of time, I just want to ask your comment too, because you allude, there's lots of stuff in the book about, especially post Kristallnacht, and as the gates were closing to the German Jewish community. Baeck, he really tried to be the mediator, didn't he? And many times between the state and the population, the Jewish community. I know you said he was arrested several times, but he really tried to work within a system, correct? He didn't, well, was that correct?
Well, he did not favor armed rebellion, because when that was tried, the result was that not only the individuals involved, but a large number of Jews in addition were shot, or in other words, or killed in some other way immediately. On the other hand, Baeck did engage secretly in opposition to the state. He had a biblical concordance where, under the word milchama, which means war in Hebrew, he put information that he had gathered about resistance forces within Germany. So that he did what he could. He also had a black box in his offices in the Jewish administration, which gave money to Jews who had gone underground in order to avoid arrest. So Leo Baeck did what he could under the circumstances. There were two periods of Jewish self-government in Germany. The first, the so-called Reichsvertretung, or representation to the state, was one that was democratic in character and allowed for a certain amount of freedom. But after Kristallnacht, after that horrible night where the synagogues burned and Jewish women were accosted and murdered, Jews were murdered, at that point, he was under the supervision of the Gestapo, so that his maneuverability was very much limited, and he could only do whatever he could. It was, of course, a great disappointment to him when in 1938 the nations of the world gathered in a French town on the Sea of Geneva called Evian-les-Bains to discuss refugee policy. And almost everybody there said, we can't admit any more Jews than we have already now, which made the Nazis very happy, because then Goering could say, you see, we don't want the Jews, the other nations don't want them either.
Right. And you write about that in the book. And as you're writing, as I was reading that, which is the same path, the same area that the Gandhi quote comes up, I kept thinking about this book that talked about the SS St. Louis, and America turning the boat away, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to run out of time soon, but I just want to say, just ask you to reflect a little bit on the final years of Baeck's life. He's in London. He is in England. He comes to the United States. You write about this caravan with the UAHC, which I, having worked for them for 30 some years and got a kind of a kick out of. You even have a picture, on page 189 of Leo Baeck at HUC. I think it's in Cincinnati. And I was looking at the room. I was trying to figure out, having gone to Cincinnati, where was that picture? Do you know? Was it in the dormitory?
It comes from the Jewish archives,
The archives.
but I've not been able to identify anyone for certain on that picture.
Talk to me a little bit about his trips to America.
I will be glad to. I would say two things with regard to America. First of all, his great honor when in America in 1948, on February 12th, he was asked to give the invocation for the House of Representatives in Washington. And because it was Lincoln's birthday, he chose to refer to Lincoln and how Lincoln said, we must not evade history. To which Baeck added, which is something fundamental to his philosophy, and that is, he prayed that we be granted history. Because for Leo Baeck, who understood history very much in spiritual terms, history was a matter of good versus evil. It was a matter of individuals who rejected God's commandment to do justly, to love the neighbor, versus those who accepted that commandment. And the other thing I would mention with regard to America is that Baeck was in America at the time of a presidential election. And he said to someone, and it's recorded in the book, what he really admired about American presidential elections is that the losing candidate is the first to congratulate the victorious candidate. Now, if that isn't relevant, I don't know what is. He really admired the peaceful transfer of power and the acceptance of the result of an election that had been completed in the United States. Of course, he could have no idea how relevant that would be many years later.
Yeah, I read that. I will admit that I burst out laughing. I said, "Oh my God!" That's true. That's true. History. He's correct. History. We don't learn it. We repeat it. Dr. Michael Meyer.
Richard, if I might, just before we close, say one other thing, but I really sums him up for me, and that is that he was a person who practiced what he preached. He was not one of those people who will preach one thing and do another. There's a Hebrew expression, tocho kavaro. His inside is like his outside. He was a man of integrity that one finds so rarely today, and that has really, more than anything else, perhaps drawn me to him. With that, I conclude.
No. That's like, I think there's a midrash somewhere about the ark and the gold in the ark, and also on the outside and the inside. And I think there's a midrash. Don't ask me to cite the citation, because I probably missed that class. I can say that now because it's almost 50 years later. So it's enough already. Anyway, Dr. Michael Meyer, the Adolph Ochs Professor Emeritus of Jewish History at HUC-JR in Cincinnati, the author of this very, very wonderful book, Rabbi Leo Baeck, Living a Religious Imperative in Troubled Times. We're going to put the flyer, I think, on the website too, if people want to click on it. Dr. Meyer, thank you very, very much for your time, for your passion about Leo Baeck, and for teaching us. And again, from my colleagues and those of you who are involved with education in synagogues or organizations, this is a great book club book, a great educational tool on a whole variety of different levels. So again, Toda Rabah, Hatzlacha, Shana Tova, and all of the above. And say hello to the short corner, the long corner, and all those corners near HUC. To all of you, thank you very, very much again for joining us on this edition of Secrets of Meaning, the podcast arm and a TV show of Jewish Sacred Aging. You can reach us at jewishsacredaging.com or email me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. If you'd like to make a tax-free donation to help support our work, go to the website, click on the donate button. Secrets of Meaning is produced at the Broadcast Center of Lebetkin Media Companies here in beautiful southern New Jersey. And we give a big shout out to our producer, the genius of Steve Lebetkin. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Address. I look forward to greeting you on our next Secrets of Meaning TV show and podcast. And until that time, stay safe, everyone. Stay healthy. Get vaccinated. Take care of yourself. Toda Rabah.